And today we have an extremely wonderful speaker, Allen Forkum, who I keep saying knows more history than anybody, spread across the whole of Nashville's history. He says no, but yes, he does. And he's going to share that with us today with the title Blood and Ink. Talk about political division, right? Allen Forkum.
Thank you, Gene and Bill, both for having me back here to the Nashville History Club, and thanks everyone for coming today. Between 1841 and 1908, there were at least 6 violent encounters involving Nashville newspaper editors. 3 of them ended in fatalities. Today, I'll tell you about each incident and explore the possible reasons for them, including how they may be connected to a larger social context. Hopefully by the end, we'll have an idea of why sometimes editors reach for their guns instead of their pens. On a night of January 11th, 1841, Jeremiah George Harris left the office at the Nashville Union newspaper and walked to the Nashville Inn on the public square. Today, this is the location of the Ben West building across James Robertson Parkway from the Metro Courthouse. While at the hotel bar, Harris heard a man loudly say, "Gentlemen, I have a denouncement to make." But before Harris could turn to see who it was, he says, the man shot him. One bullet went through his right arm, paralyzing it, and another went into his chest. Harris collapsed to the ground, and his gun toppled to the floor beside him. Meanwhile, the man who shot him, 23-year-old Robert C. Foster, was waiting in the lobby for the authorities to arrive. Foster was an attorney and the son of former U.S. Senator Ephraim H. Foster. Young Foster would claim that Harris was coming at him with a dueling pistol, and that had he not fired first, he would have, quote, paid the forfeit of my own life. What was the cause of the shooting? Well, apparently, days earlier, at the same hotel bar, the young Foster had harshly criticized former President Andrew Jackson. Harris had risen to Jackson's defense and insisted that Foster clarify whether or not he was criticizing Jackson's policies, which to Harris was acceptable, or if Foster was criticizing Jackson personally, which to Harris was not acceptable. Foster said he had nothing against Jackson personally, and thus the clash was avoided, at least for a few days. Just over a month later, Robert C. Foster III would advertise a new law firm with his brother William, who had also brandished a gun at the shooting. Harris even believed that William had fired one of the bullets. Both brothers were prosecuted, but were acquitted 6 months after. Foster would later serve as an attorney general. The 32-year-old Jeremiah George Harris would survive his wounds and go back to editing the Nashville Union. Harris later traveled the world as a purser for the U.S. Navy, and it was in that capacity that he acquired, probably illicitly, this gift for the Tennessee Historical Society. Some of you may recall seeing the Egyptian mummy in the State Museum. It's pictured here when the State Museum was in the basement of the War Memorial Building. The mummy is not on display at the new State Museum, however, apparently due to preservation and cultural concerns. On May 19th, 1848, 2 men met at the post office, which was then located at the corner of Cherry Street and Cedar Street. Today, this is the intersection where the city bus terminal is located at 4th Avenue North and MLK Boulevard. James J S Billings was the editor of the Daily Orthopolitan. William High Smith, the editor of the Nashville Gazette. Both men were in their late 20s. In the Gazette, Smith had published a rumor about Billings begging Whig Party leaders for a political appointment. Billings denied the accusation, writing, quote, "The paragraph in the Daily Gazette of yesterday we consider too malignant and too puerile for further notice than silent contempt." During their meeting at the post office, matters escalated. A blow was struck, reported the Daily Center State American. A scuffle ensued, during which Mr. Smith snatched the spear from the cane of Mr. Billings and stabbed him with it in the pit of the stomach. It is thought the wound is mortal. This is what a cane sword looks like. Billings survived the stabbing, though I couldn't find much about the remainder of his life. He was a married man, a Baptist, member of the Temperance Union. He published a poem titled, "Oh, Wherefore is Sadness?" And in 1860, he donated the complete files of the Daily Orthopolitan to the Tennessee Historical Society, which was, quote, highly gratified to obtain so important a contribution. Billings died of consumption in 1862. William High Smith stayed in the newspaper business, but stopped editing for a few years after the fight. Later in life, he was a reporter for the Associated Press, even sending dispatches from his deathbed until his last day. As one obituary put it, literally dying in the harness. He was so highly regarded by the industry that for his funeral in 1873, 5 pallbearers were assigned from local publications. It was raining on the morning of November 18th, 1859, as a small man ran quickly up Cherry Street toward the offices of the Daily News. This is the general area, which today is 4th Avenue North between Dederick and Union, where the Doubletree Hotel and the UBS buildings are located. The 30-year-old George Gilmore Poindexter was feeble and badly nearsighted. A witness that morning said he looked pale with bluish lips. He carried an umbrella, and somewhere on his person were 2 pistols. For the past week, as the editor of the Union and American, a Democratic paper, Poindexter was having a war of words with Allen A. Hall, editor of the Daily News, an opposition party paper. Among other things, Hall had accused Democrats of agitating on the issue of slavery for political profit. Poindexter responded to Hall's editorials were, quote, utterly destitute of truth, and that Hall was counting on, quote, the supposed privileges of age to shield him from responsibility, meaning that Hall, who was 57, would not be expected to physically fight back. On that rainy morning, Allen A. Hall had answered Poindexter in the Daily News, saying that he was, quote, fully able and prepared to protect my person against assault and to punish the assailant. As Poindexter approached the Daily News office, Hall stepped onto the sidewalk with a double-barreled shotgun. He called for Poindexter to stop, but Poindexter kept walking toward the older man. Hall called for him to stop twice more. Accounts differ on whether or not Poindexter pulled out his gun, but apparently he did stop. Hall didn't hesitate to fire after his last warning. Poindexter fell instantly from 9 buckshots to the chest. He dropped his umbrella and a gun. Tragically, just 5 days later, the senior editor of the Union and American would also die, but of natural causes, perhaps partly due to the stress caused by the death of his fellow editor. Here's the Daily News notice of the death of his revered competitor. Now, the bold black lines are a newspaper's way to show mourning, like the black crepe paper hung from windows and hearses. The thin lines, normally between columns, are called rules. For this effect, they simply turn the rules upside down and printed from the wide base of the lead piece. It's worth noting that Hall's Daily News did not display such mourning for Poindexter. Allen A. Hall, who fought for the Union during the Civil War, died in July 1867 while serving as United States Minister to Bolivia. a local obituary praising Hall said, "The unhappy incident which gave the color of blood to his latter days was perhaps the most unfortunate occurrence in Tennessee politics, as well as his own career, regretted by good men everywhere, and by none, as we know full well, more bitterly and more sincerely than by himself." I was walking up the street towards my office, and suddenly I heard a shot fired from behind me. Quickest thought, I felt a shock. That shot felled me to the ground. This is the beginning of John L. Littleton's statement to a reporter given while Littleton lay bleeding in his bed. He was 29 years old, with a wife and child, and was the editor of the National Review, a weekly Republican newspaper in Nashville. During his recent failed mayoral campaign, Littleton had made some enemies among fellow Republicans. On Christmas Eve, 1887, Littleton was walking down High Street by the entrance to Watkins Institute. And this is where he was shot. Today, this is near the 6th Avenue exit for the library parking garage between Church and Commerce. Continuing his statement. "I had a revolver, having been previously warned of the danger. My arm was filled with shot so that I could not use it. I looked and saw a man standing in the door on the opposite side of the street with a gun sighted on me. That man was Joe Banks. I said, 'That is enough, don't fire again.' He fired 2 more loads into my leg." Joseph R. Banks was a real estate agent and an active Republican who had opposed Littleton's mayoral nomination. He was 26 years old, unmarried, and lived with his parents on Belmont Avenue. The Daily American said of him, quote, "He has moved in the very best social circles, and for many accomplishments as well as pleasing demeanor and handsome appearance, has been quite a favorite." Using 2 double-barreled shotguns, Banks had fired on Littleton from an empty house that he'd apparently rented to lay in wait. After fleeing the scene, Banks got into a waiting buggy and went directly to the police station. His first day in jail was spent in a comfortably furnished, carpeted room where he was reportedly visited by an estimated 500 friends and supporters, which included, quote, "the very best citizens of Nashville." The Daily American said the cause of the tragedy was an editorial by Littleton in the National Review, in which he made a denouncement of Banks and was, quote, "of such a character as to render it absolutely unfit for repetition in the American, charging him with nameless acts of total depravity." Even a friend of Littleton's, E.B. Stallman of the Nashville Banner, would later say that Littleton's use of his paper as a medium of personal abuse and criticism was, quote, "inexcusable and indefensible." Littleton rallied while recuperating at home long enough for his family to arrive from Texas, even his father. But 4 days after the shooting, he succumbed to the wounds caused by 30 lead shots, including some in his liver. At Banks' trial for murder, his defense argued that Littleton had fired first, bringing forth witnesses who claimed to have heard 5 shots, not 4, as witnesses for the state testified. That trial ended in a hung jury. Banks was out of jail on bond in less than a year. The lawyers for both sides kept agreeing to continuance after continuance, year after year, until finally on April 8th, 1892, over 4 years after the shooting, Joseph R. Banks was acquitted of murdering John J. Littleton. Now, before continuing on to Nashville's 2 most famous editorial rencounters, as they were sometimes called, let's take a moment to consider some of the possible reasons for this violent behavior. When I first started looking into these cases, I couldn't make sense of how an editorial disagreement could so easily lead to bloodshed. Today we might be offended by an editorial, but generally speaking, violence is not on the table as an acceptable response. Such was not the case 170 years ago. And looking at these 4 incidents, we can see some common aspects. For instance, that the clashes typically involved white males in their 20s and 30s who circulated in the upper echelons of 19th century Nashville society. In this historical context, 2 other aspects stand out, and fortunately, historians have researched and written extensively about them. One is the code of honor, the other is politics. Now, the code of honor is a huge topic, and I frankly don't know enough about it to fully discuss it here. But to at least see how it might be connected to these events, I have relied on the book Southern Honor, Ethics and Behavior in the Old South by Bertram Wyatt Brown. In the book, he explores the history of the honor code, its roots in ancient Greek, then the chivalric knights of Europe, and ultimately the frontiersmen of America, although similar codes are in other countries as well. He also explains how the code of honor evolved over time to have different meanings in different social classes and even in different sections of the country. Wyatt Brown contrasted the code of honor with the individualism of today, where one is expected to have self-esteem based on what one thinks of oneself. He wrote, honor resides in the individual as his understanding of who he is and where he belongs in the ordered ranks of society. In other words, honor is reputation. The opinion of others was an indispensable part of personal identity and gauge of self-worth. Or as historian Edward L. Ayers put it, honor is, quote, a system of values within which you have exactly as much worth as others confer upon you. Today, we mostly think of the code of honor in connection to duels. The Code Duello, as it was known, was a set of rules devised to allow 2 upper-class gentlemen, men, to settle their differences honorably, that is, to possibly murder one another in a gentlemanly fashion. There was even a rule book published in 1858. The idea was that a formal duel civilized a necessary fight to defend one's honor, as compared to, say, having a brawl in the heat of the moment. Rarely did the clashes in Nashville play out so formally, as we've already seen. Though intermediaries known as seconds might have delivered notes and face-to-face denouncements might have been made, it usually just ended in a quick and savage gunfight. We see indications of the code of honor in some of the preceding stories. For example, Robert C. Foster III, the man who shot his opponent at the hotel bar, wrote that he was, quote, driven to the wall, first in defense of his honor and then his very existence, and cannot appeal in vain to a generous and enlightened community. Joseph R. Banks, who shot the editor 4 times with 2 shotguns, was reportedly, quote, satisfied that he could have done nothing less and lived in the community. And G.G. Poindexter was described as a, quote, quiet, peaceable, orderly citizen, but one who would not permit any insinuation against his honor, and was morbidly sensitive to imputations or reflections on his character or statements. Newspaper men were particularly vulnerable within the Code of Honor system because their very business was speaking directly to the community at large, even trying to shape public opinion itself for political ends. Their printed words carried a lot of power. It could be dangerous to both themselves and to the subjects of their editorials. Of William High Smith, the man who stabbed another editor with a cane sword, it was said that he had, quote, a manliness with which he was ready to defend the truth of any principle espoused. Keep in mind, dueling was illegal. Duels were often fought in fields just beyond city limits or across state borders to avoid prosecution. Citizens and editors always expressed a hand-wringing disapproval of duels, particularly if someone was killed, and yet the same community would readily use public shame to control the behavior of individuals. Wyatt Brown called this community tyranny. The code of honor was held above the law itself because to protect one's honor or the honor of the community, a person could justify almost any action, whether it was moral or not, or whether it was legal or not. If the community approved, even the law turned a blind eye. As Wyatt Brown put it, honor, not conscience, shame, not guilt, were the psychological and social underpinnings of the Southern culture. This attitude also led to appalling community behavior, such as mob justice and extra-legal punishments. Wyatt Brown features an incident in his book involving the tarring of a Natchez, Mississippi planter who had brutally murdered his wife but had not been punished by the courts. Nashville has its own examples. This illustration shows the 1835 public beating of abolitionist Amos Dresser, who was condemned by a vigilance and safety committee that included 7 elders from a Nashville church. And this drawing shows the 1892 lynching of Ephraim Grizzard, a black man who was hanged from a downtown bridge and his body shot full of bullets while thousands looked on. There's no doubt that the code of honor and the system of public shaming kept some bad people in check, and it certainly made people careful of what they said of other people in public. But as can be seen in the examples cited so far, it came at a high price. As I mentioned before, another standout aspect of these national editorial fights, the catalyst really, was politics. So far, I've focused mainly on Nashville, but here wasn't the only place where men felt compelled to kill one another over a disagreement. Washington, D.C. was, in the 9th century, as it is today, the center of national politics. It was also the center of political violence. We're probably all familiar with the famous 1804 duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, 2 longtime political opponents. If you know the Hamilton musical well, you may even be able to recite the song 10 Duel Commandments. But in researching her book, The Field of Blood, which I highly recommend, author Joanne B. Freeman discovered that between 1830 and 1860, there were, quote, more than 70 violent incidents between congressmen in the House and in the Senate chambers or on nearby streets and dueling grounds, most of them long forgotten. Congressmen even thought of each other as combatant or non-combatant. Freeman says that Southern congressmen were particularly known for using threats of violence, if not violence itself, to intimidate Northern congressmen, especially regarding laws about slavery. The most famous example of this is the 1856 caning of Senator Charles Sumner by Representative Preston Brooks. Sumner had accused a South Carolina senator of having an ugly mistress who was, quote, the harlot, slavery. This offended Brooks, who was also from South Carolina. The next day, Brooks walked into the Senate chamber, made a hasty denouncement, and began beating Sumner over the head with a cane while he sat at his desk. Sumner survived the attack, and Preston Brooks survived the House censure. After that, he resigned anyway, but Brooks was reelected by South Carolinians who apparently appreciated his defense of their state's honor. This incident is considered by some to be the first blows of the Civil War. In fact, both Freeman and Wyatt Brown argue that the Code of Honor was an important factor in causing the Civil War. Representatives were, after all, representing their constituents. So eventually the fight spread from the House and Senate chambers to the rest of the country. But another less known congressional encounter is more telling for our purposes because it involved a newspaper editor. James Watson Webb was the editor of the New York Courier and Inquirer. In 1838, he became embroiled in a congressional controversy after he published vague accusations of corruption among Democrats. Offended by comments made by Northern Democrat Jonathan Silly, Webb traveled to Washington, D.C., and on arriving asked Representative William Graves to deliver a note to Silly. Graves did not want to get involved in an honor dispute, but he agreed to deliver the note after being assured it was not a challenge for a duel. In a cordial encounter, Silly politely refused the note, as he had no interest in a fight. Neither man knew what to do next, so they went to their friends for advice. It turned out that by not accepting the note, Silly had insulted fellow Congressman Graves, at least by code of honor rules. 3 days later, the two men were standing in a field 80 to 90 yards apart, each armed with a rifle. The first round, 2 rounds of the duel, left both men unharmed. So after each round, their seconds convened in hopes that the other party was satisfied. Did Silly's willingness to exchange fire satisfy Graves? No, it didn't. Would Silly acknowledge that newspaper man Webb was a gentleman? No, he wouldn't. So on the third round, Graves shot Silly in the stomach and he died minutes later. So here we have two men who didn't even want to fight, but who were nonetheless tragically drawn into a deadly encounter, all because of the honor code. James Watson Webb was criticized for precipitating the duel, and rumors spread around Washington that he would face a confrontation. Webb paraded up and down Pennsylvania Avenue fully armed to show that he was ready for a fight. He was mocked in this cartoon. But not all fighting politicians were in Washington, D.C. Nashville had one of the most famous of all, Andrew Jackson. By the time he was president, Jackson was literally full of lead from dueling. In 1806, Jackson fought a duel with Charles Dickinson after the latter cast aspersions on the honor of Jackson's wife, Rachel. Dickinson ended up dead. Jackson ended up with a bullet in his chest. And in 1813, Jackson was angry with Thomas Hart Benton over public criticism. So he accosted Benton outside the City Hotel in Nashville. Benton said, "Now, you damned rascal, I'm going to punish you. Defend yourself." According to historian Robert V. Rimini, the ensuing melee involved a number of parties using pistols, a knife, and yes, even a cane sword. Jackson almost bled to death in a bed at the Nashville Inn. And he carried bullet shrapnel in his arm for almost 20 years, along with the bullet from the Dickinson duel. Remember the story I told you, the first story I told you? 28 years later, Jeremiah George Harris would be shot in the same hotel for defending Jackson's honor. So in light of the code of honor in politics, let's take a look at the two most well-known incidents of editorial violence in Nashville's history. John L. Marling was the 27-year-old editor of the Nashville Union. When he exchanged gunfire across Cherry Street with Felix K. Zollicoffer, 40-year-old editor of the Republican Banner. The day was August 20th, 1852. So this was 4 years after the cane sword stabbing in the post office and 7 years before the shotgunning on Cherry Street. Does anyone want to take a guess at what Zollicoffer and Marling were fighting about? Well, if you go by Zollicoffer's biography and a number of biographical articles, the reasons was this bridge. The supposed controversy involved where to locate a planned bridge. Nashville needed to replace its first bridge because it was too low and hindered riverboat traffic. Marling was said to have accused Zollicoffer, who was on the board of the Broad Street Bridge Company, of having a self-interested bias to locate the bridge near his own property, thus increasing its value. Zollicoffer did own land in Edgefield, and the bridge location was changed from Broad Street to the public square. But there's one big problem with this story. The bridge was completed in 1850, 2 years before the fight. So looking at editorials by both men in 1852, the actual cause becomes apparent. And you guessed it, politics. Zollicoffer had been a state comptroller and a state senator, and due to his success in using editorials to help fellow Whigs get elected, he was known as the Kingmaker. There was a presidential race in 1852, when Whig candidate Winfield Scott and Democrat Franklin Pierce were running. Zollicoffer himself was running for U.S. House of Representatives. In the banner, Zollicoffer had been accusing the Northerner Pierce of being associated with abolitionists. In the Union, Marling had strongly defended Pierce, insisting that the Northerner was friendly to the South. Eventually, Marling went too far, accusing his competitor of intending to belie Pierce. Zollicoffer bristled at the charge, which was close to calling him a liar. He warned Marling that he should be careful not to, quote, provoke unfriendly relations. But on August 19th, Marling responded, saying the banner was, quote, belying General Pierce. He actually italicized the word. Then he said, we use the word in all its length and breadth. It is shameless misrepresentation. It is a course unworthy of an honorable man. That was the final straw for Zollicoffer. Headlines the next day would read personal difficulty, unfortunate affray, and perhaps most accurately, street fight. After having their seconds exchange notes, the two combatants agreed to meet outside the Union office at the intersections of Cedar and Cherry Street. Coincidentally, the same intersection where Billings and Smith had had their fight at the post office. After the fight, the Union defiantly reprinted the offending editorial and reported that Marling had been shot, quote, on the right side of the face, slightly above the nose and ranging backward to the cartilage of the neck below the ear. The Union also said that Marling, quote, did nothing which he could have avoided without sacrifice of every claim to the respect of honorable men. The banner remained silent about the rencounter until August 24th, when Zollicoffer provided his version of events, which, by the way, everyone seemed to agree on. Zollicoffer met Marling in the street outside his office, outside of Marling's office. He denounced Marling, who then shot at him, missing. Zollicoffer's gun failed, so they both shot again. Marling was hit in the face. Zollicoffer was hit on the hand, causing a slight flesh wound, as he put it. The Union and the banner continued their political bickering, though it was toned down quite a bit. Pierce won the presidential election. Zollicoffer lost his bid to be for the U.S. Congress, but he would later win and serve 3 terms. On the eve of the Civil War, Zollicoffer opposed Tennessee's secession and was part of an unsuccessful peace commission sent to Washington, D.C. But ultimately, he would join the Confederacy and become the first Confederate general to be killed in the Western Theater at the Battle of Mill Springs in Kentucky. His death was said to have shocked Nashvillians into realizing the reality of the war. A large funeral procession was held for him on February 2nd, 1862. 2 weeks later, the Union Army took over the city. John L. Marling would recover. After serving as an editor for a few more years, he was appointed U.S. Minister to Guatemala by President Franklin Pierce, the very man whom he had defended. Marling returned to Nashville and in 1856 died of tuberculosis. Today, both men are buried in the city cemetery. Here is Marling's grave, and it is within sight of Zollicoffer's grave. One of the articles that was mistaken about the bridge controversy had the following story, which may or may not be true. 6 years after the fight, the antagonists casually met. Zollicoffer anxiously inquired of Marling's health and if it had been affected by the dueling wound. And Marling replied that it had not, that his disease was of the lungs. Zollicoffer expressed his gratitude at this and hoped for his restoration to health. Robin Cooper shot former U.S. Senator Ward Carmack 3 times on the evening of November 9th, 1908. The fatal bullet was thought to be the one that went into the side of his neck and out of his mouth, knocking out 2 teeth. The first doctor on the scene concluded that Carmack was dead before he hit the pavement of 7th Avenue North, near Union Street and Polk Flats Apartments. Today, there is a historical marker by the spot, not for Carmack, but for the long-gone residence of President James K. Polk, torn down for the Polk Flats building, which today is also gone. At the time of the shooting, Carmack was the editor of the Nashville Tennessean. A fierce prohibitionist, his editorials had offended the shooter's father, Colonel Duncan Cooper. But the colonel and the editor had not always been enemies. 22 years earlier, Duncan Cooper had given Carmack a job as a writer at the Nashville American. When Carmack later left there as an editor to take an editing job in Memphis, he wrote, "I desire especially to acknowledge the debt I owe and the gratitude I feel toward Colonel D.B. Cooper, under whose management I first became acquainted with the American and with journalism." As editor of the Memphis Commercial, Carmack was a moral crusader against gambling, vice districts, alcohol, machine politics, and even American imperialism in the Philippines. His clashes with another Memphis editor even led to a planned duel just over the Mississippi border. It ended up being thwarted by police. But Carmack had another crusade, one against black people. Here is how an editorial ended titled "The Negro Question." Quote, "The plain truth is that the Negro is being educated out of his sense of respect for the white race, the only bond which can keep his barbarous instincts in subjection. We do not refer to the mere book education received in public schools, but to everything which tends to lift the Negro's aspirations above his proper place as the white man's servant in a white man's country. The white man must rule, the Negro must submit." That was published in 1892. Carmack was elected by Tennessee to the U.S. Congress in 1897 and to the U.S. Senate in 1901. His racist crusading led to clashes with another Memphis editor, Ida B. Wells. Wells was co-editor of the Free Speech, a publication dedicated to black civil rights. As an outspoken opponent of lynchings, which were particularly common at the time, Wells wrote in May 1892 that, quote, 8 Negroes lynched since the last issue of Free Speech, 3 for killing a white man, and 5 for the same old racket, the new alarm about raping white women, end quote. She asserted that the, quote, threadbare pretext of rape often used to justify lynchings might really be about consensual relations between black men and white women. Carmack mistakenly concluded that Wells's co-editor, a man named J L Flemings, had written the editorial. And Carmack probably thought he was being chivalrous when he replied, quote, "There are some things that the Southern man will not tolerate, and the obscene intimations against Southern white women of the foregoing have brought the writer to the very outermost limit of public patience." This was, of course, a threat of lynching. Another Memphis paper was more explicit, writing that whites might have a duty to tie Fleming to a stake, brand him, and, quote, perform a surgical operation on him with a pair of shears. Fleming fled Memphis to avoid being lynched, and the offices of the Free Speech were confiscated and closed. Fortunately, Wells was already out of town in New York City. Both were warned never to return to Memphis, and Wells ultimately settled in Chicago. Irked by Northerners who embraced Ida B. Wells and her crusade against Southern lynching of blacks, Carmack would later call her a wench and a black harlot in his paper. Now, in the Code of Honor system, there's an emphasis on bravery when it comes, When it comes to courage, it's worth remembering that Wells was a black woman born into slavery who in the 19th century chose to go head-to-head with a socially and politically powerful white supremacist. And she, like all American women at the time, wouldn't even get the right to vote for another 28 years. In his political career, Carmack would eventually lose his seat in the U.S. House of Representatives to fellow Democrat Malcolm R. Patterson, who won with help from Carmack's old friend, Colonel Duncan Cooper. In 1908, Carmack would again go up against Patterson, this time for the Democratic gubernatorial nomination in Tennessee. And again, Carmack would lose to Patterson, who was again helped by Cooper. Patterson became governor, and Carmack became editor of the Nashville Tennessean. Carmack was not happy about being twice beaten by Patterson and Cooper. In the Tennessean, he repeatedly used caustic sarcasm to attack the two by name. Through an intermediary, Colonel Cooper demanded that Carmack never print his name in the Tennessean again. Carmack responded the next day with an editorial that began, "To Major Duncan Brown Cooper." Both Cooper and Carmack obtained guns for self-defense. Carmack told a friend that, quote, "No man is foolish enough to kill another on such a flimsy provocation." But Colonel Cooper, a 64-year-old Confederate veteran who was an old South gentleman who lived by the code of honor, Cooper's daughter begged her father not to fight with Carmack. He responded by asking if she preferred that he lay down his manhood. Robin Cooper, the colonel's 27-year-old son, worked with friends and supporters to find a solution to the brewing battle. He carried a gun, he said, to protect his father. On the evening of November 9th, Governor Patterson invited the Coopers to the governor's mansion on 7th Avenue North to discuss the problem. But Carmack also lived on 7th Avenue North, just a block away. And so, as he was walking home, their paths crossed. Carmack supporters would insist that this crossing of paths was no coincidence, that the Coopers and Governor Patterson had plotted an assassination. Here's the Tennessean's first lines announcing the killing. Because he dared to oppose the might of the saloons in Tennessee, Edward Ward Carmack lies cold in death, and 3 gaping wounds cry out for vengeance of his murderers, Colonel Duncan B. Cooper and his son, Robin Cooper. The killing was murder, cold-blooded, deliberate, premeditated, with every detail planned out beforehand, without justification. In his book, The Carmack Cooper shooting, James Somerville explains the version of events that seem to be accepted today. Carmack was greeting his landlady as he walked up 7th Avenue North toward the Capitol. At Union and 7th, young Cooper, and that's right by the War Memorial Building, at the corner of the War Memorial Building. Young Cooper saw Carmack coming up the street, and he tried to steer his father away, but the colonel was suspicious of the redirection. On seeing his nemesis, Duncan Cooper jerked away from his son's grasp and started down the street to, he would claim, only verbally confront Carmack. On seeing the colonel marching toward him, gesturing and calling out, Carmack assumed the old man was going to kill him, and probably rightfully so. So he pulled out his gun and started firing. Young Cooper lunged in front of his father and was hit by a bullet. Another bullet only pierced his coat. Robin Cooper drew his gun and fired 3 times, killing Carmack. The colonel never even fired his weapon. Hundreds of people crowded onto the street, many from out of town, just to see the scene of the killing. When darkness fell, they reportedly lit matches to get a better look at the blood. The Coopers were arrested, then tried and convicted of murder. Robin Cooper would eventually be acquitted, and Governor Patterson would pardon Colonel Duncan Cooper, which partisans took as yet another indication of a conspiracy. The public also turned against Patterson who withdrew from seeking a third term. In 1922, Robin Cooper would be murdered in Belmead, bludgeoned to death with a rock, but that's another story. I'll recommend that you read Somerville's book to learn about that. Edward Ward Carmack became a martyr for the cause of Prohibition, which was passed in Tennessee in 1909. Within a week of the killing, at the memorial ceremony at Ryman Auditorium, attended by 8,000 people, a resolution was passed to begin work on building a permanent memorial to the fallen crusader. In 1925, Carmack's statue was unveiled at the state capitol to great fanfare, and it stood there for 95 years. You may recall what recently happened to this statue. On May 30th, 2020, there was a downtown protest against police brutality, a protest sparked by the Minnesota killing of a black man named George Floyd by a white police officer. During the protest, Carmack's statue was toppled to the ground. I knew of Carmack in relation to the gunfight, but admittedly had only a vague notion about his clashes with Wells until I resourced it for the Nashville Retrospect newspaper. While at the Tennessee State Library and Archives, which was then beside the Capitol, I walked over to see the fallen statue, but it had already been removed and stored at the Tennessee State Museum. While there, I noticed that someone had placed a banner over Carmack's pedestal, covering his famous Pledge to the South. Clearly, whoever made that sign knew Carmack's history with Wells. After his death, the Tennessean printed pages full of tributes to Carmack, and in them we might see the last vestiges of the code of honor. He was described as a, quote, chivalric gentleman, a knightly figure, who was morally courageous and a fearless editor. There was no mention of his support for lynching, no mention of the editorial in which Carmack mocked, quote, the halo of martyrdom encircling the kinky head of Ida Wells. Today I'll give this fighting editor the last word. Virtue knows no color line, Ida B. Wells wrote in 1894. And the chivalry which depends upon the complexion of skin and texture of hair can command no respect. Thank you. Now, before I take any questions, I have two announcements to make. Notice that I didn't say denouncements. We, in the retrospect, we covered some of these stories, and so you may have gotten a little flyer. If you didn't, there's one up here. If you want to know more about some of these stories, like Carmack and Wells, Dickinson and Jackson's duel is extensively covered. The grave was found in a neighborhood near here. Even the mummy, we've got a great story about this. So there's 4 issues there. You can buy them online. I can take cash up here if you want those, if you're interested. Also, at the end of the question and answer, please remain seated because either Bill or Gene will have more to tell us about upcoming History Club events, which will be excellent. They've been working hard to fill up the schedule with lots of great material. So are there any questions?
Are you going to mention the weird story involving Zollicoffer's death and what
in Mill Springs? Yeah, I mean, if you want to tell it, you can. But
I want to hear.
He was during the battle. There was some confusion about where he was, and he didn't realize he was as far into the Union lines as he thought, and so he was killed.
Killed by his own.
Yeah, there was some confusion. Oh,
He yelled fire, and not realizing he was yelling it at the enemy.
Yeah.
And they said, okay, and they blew his head, and they killed him right then.
Yeah, and that's a good reason for me to mention that I've greatly summarized these stories, so there's a lot more detail that I've left out. Like, for instance, Alan A. Hall, who shot Poindexter with a shotgun. Poindexter and his son had almost had a duel the day before. So there's a lot there that I had to basically skim over. You had a question?
Yeah. In retrospect, looking back, how would you judge Carmack?
I think he was a terrible man. I've been reading these old newspapers for over 13, 14 years. I've never seen anything as explicitly racist as what he wrote. And I know he fit in the time, and obviously there were lots of people who loved him. He was very populist. He fought against liquor interests, but in his death, got prohibition, helped propel it. It wasn't entirely that, which I don't think was a good thing. So yeah, I don't hold him in high regard. Anyone else have any questions?
Well, the hell with that statue, you said it was moved to the...
It's so when it was toppled, those statues made of bronze are pieced together, welded together when they're construction. And when he was knocked over, the top of his head, a piece fell out, and that is now missing. Apparently it was taken. So he is stored at the State Museum, and I think he'll stay in storage forever. They might put it in a museum, display it at some point. It's actually a really well done statue. A woman whose name is Nancy Cox McCormick sculpted it, and she sculpted a few around town, and was an excellent artist. So I suspect they'll keep it.
Who paid for it?
That's a good question. I think the state of Tennessee paid for some of it, but it was mostly funds were raised to put it up. And the pedestal was there for a long time, maybe a decade or more before they even finished the statue. Yeah, you had a question?
Just a quick comment on Sunday. I was at the Tennessee State Museum. It's a completely different place. You need to go. And that I noticed that the volume wasn't there. I used to take my daughter there regularly because it's free and it's child friendly. But I really recommend visiting the new museum. It's a new Tennessee, and it made me very optimistic, especially about the future of Tennessee as reflected by the State Museum. It's completely different.
Yes, I do highly recommend it. I mean, the old one was in the basement of a building, and so this one's much better designed, easier to access, and
the narrative is very different too.
Yes,
Not just white people.
but no money. They took that out, and I love the Mummy. Honestly, it was great to go see it. So, yes.
When did honor killing die out, and was there a reason it stopped happening?
Well, I don't really know because I'm not an expert on it. I think it just sort of faded away. These authors, Freeman contends that for various reasons, it stayed popular in the South longer than it did in the North. And Northerners frowned upon it so much that they expected their politicians not to fight back, that was a bad thing. And of course, that was taken advantage of by a lot of Southern congressmen in the political battles. And she contends that one of the reasons for the rise of the Republican Party was because some of them started fighting back. But I think there are probably vestiges of this sort of thinking today. I mean, it's hard not to look at this and really just see some guys who got mad and just wanted to fight. And that still happens today. There's still road rage, among some cultures, like Islamic culture in the Middle East, fundamentalistic Islamic culture, there's still honor killings of women who behave in a way that puts shame on the family. So it's not entirely gone. But in America, it just, I think, faded away, fortunately.
I didn't hear you say very much about justice being meted out for these violent acts, maybe.
There wasn't much, yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
What I was going to say, is it your impression that either the honor code was implicitly or explicitly taken into account by juries? It was that pervasive in our society that it was a real barrel, and the antagonist might have been thinking in advance, this is going to be taken into consideration.
Yes, I think so. the way that Wyatt Brown describes it is that he says we shouldn't look at it at that time period as being outside the law. He said it complemented the law. And so if the law failed, the community had another recourse. So yeah, I think that some of these murders were committed. I mean, Banks rented a room and waited for the guy and shot him. And it was just pretty clearly premeditated and planned, and he had 2 double-barrel shotguns, used them both. And he got acquitted. So I just think it was the type of thing that was accepted enough. Now, it got over. One thing I noticed is that the trials were held very close together to the incident, but as time goes on, they get farther and farther and farther apart. And I just think it eventually you just couldn't hide from what was going on. It was just obvious what was going on, and so people stopped. It stopped being something they thought they could get away with. And the law, I think, eventually started doing what it was supposed to do and not turning a blind eye to it as often. Because even if they arrested them, they might not be. Like, I couldn't figure out why in the Littleton Banks case, they kept agreeing to continuances. I don't know what was the mechanic, but it was 4 years before he was ever had his second trial, and then even then was acquitted. So I don't understand why that was going on. Yes, sir.
The emphasis today was on editors. What proportion of honor killings were editors versus the rest of society?
I don't know, but it's a good question. It seemed like it was worse with editors because they were the ones putting the public opinions out. So some of these duels earlier in time would happen, would be made public with a poster if it wasn't printed in a newspaper, so that the person who was offended could make sure everyone knew that this guy had done something to him that was going to be settled. So in a way, the newspapers were a part of the whole system. And so I think that may have concentrated the fighting among editors. That said, I really don't know, because there were other duels reported and I would see reports of it, but these duels involved the newspaper itself, so they reported on it. And so I don't know if there was a disproportion. I wondered if it was worse here than other places. I found one article where in Mississippi there was a killing involving an editor, and as was the case here and I assume everywhere else, it was occasion for a newspaper to revisit all the past shootings. And they had 5 in Mississippi, but that was the whole state. This was 6 that I found just in Nashville. And I'm not even sure that it's all of them. I think it's all of them. But I found an article just today from 1909 about a shoving match between an editor and a Speaker of the House in 1909. So yeah, I don't really know the answer. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.